2024 was a year filled with cases that captivated not only the true crime community, but the entire nation. From landmark trials holding parents accountable for the actions of their child, to a deadly shooting on a movie set, from allegations of massive cover-ups and conspiracies, to history-making cases with seemingly no end in sight. Let's break down some of the cases that shocked, fascinated, and confused us, making 2024 a truly unique year in true crime. Number 1. The trials of Jennifer and James Crumbley, parents of mass school shooter Ethan Crumbley, took place in January and March, respectively. In November 2021, the Crumbleys' 15-year-old son killed 4 students and wounded several others in a horrific shooting at Oxford High School in Michigan. The Crumbley parents were charged with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, marking the first case in the U.S. to hold parents criminally responsible for their child's independent criminal actions. The prosecution said Jennifer was grossly negligent when she failed to tell Oxford High School that the family had guns, including a 9mm handgun that her son used at a shooting range on the weekend before the attack. Prosecutors also highlighted Jennifer's inexplicable conduct during a meeting with school officials on the day of the shooting, where they discussed Ethan's disturbing drawings and behavior, but Jennifer refused to take her son home. She was found guilty on all 4 counts. James Crumbley's trial followed in March, with many of the same witnesses testifying. Prosecutors pointed to his role in purchasing the handgun for his son and his failure to secure it properly. They argued that James had several opportunities to prevent the tragedy, while his defense contended that James had no idea his son would commit a mass shooting. After nearly 10 hours of deliberations, the jury convicted James of 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, following much of the same rationale as his wife's conviction. Although tried separately, Jennifer and James were sentenced together in April to 10 to 15 years prison. Jennifer is currently seeking an appeal, arguing that critical evidence was withheld from the defense at trial. The hearing is scheduled for January 8th. What happened here? Well, the jury in both cases seemed to focus a lot of their attention on how the gun was secured, or more accurately, left unsecured in this case. Given Ethan Crumbley's obvious disturbing mental state, his troubling, violent drawings, and even statements he made to his parents and prosecutors focused on how this created an environment for foreseeable violence. Because his parents did not do enough about this, and because they allowed the gun to be introduced into the equation, and I think that that is really critical. I think if it were not for the fact that the parents were the ones who introduced the gun into this situation, they would not have been charged at all. But they did. And by doing so, in a situation where you have a person, a young man, suffering from obvious mental problems, they carried a degree of liability for his actions. That was the argument made by prosecutors, especially given the fact that he had access to an improperly secured weapon. But the question I have is, where does this leave us? Criminal law is very particular in being concerned about outlining what conduct is acceptable and what is not acceptable. What was unacceptable here? Was it purchasing of the gun? Was it the securing of the gun? Was it the failure to get him better treatment for his problems? Was it their lack of intervention? Basically, the question we should know coming out of this case is, what lessons should parents be drawing from this case? End of the day, this young man took independent actions. He got the gun. Whether it was secured properly or not, he was the one who went and got that gun from wherever it was stored. He hid it. He took it with him to school. He brought it to school with the intention of doing harm to others. He's the one that pulled the trigger. Are we creating a slippery slope when it comes to criminal liability if we're saying that a person can take all of those independent actions, but because you were negligent and you should have foreseen the problems, and you were negligent and therefore liable for the actions of someone else, that you can be held criminally responsible? I don't know if this case gives us definitive answers to that. but it does certainly create some questions that we should all consider. But what do you guys think? Is this a clear-cut case of criminal conduct in your view, or a troubling precedent that we're looking at? Number 2, the aftermath from a tragic shooting on the set of the movie Russ unfolded over several years, finally concluding in 2024 in 2 trials with dramatically different outcomes. On October 21, 2021, Alec Baldwin accidentally discharged a prop gun, killing cinematographer Helena Hutchins and injuring director Joel Souza. Baldwin, armorer Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, and assistant director David Halls were all implicated in the tragedy. By February of this year, Gutierrez-Reed's trial began, where she faced charges of involuntary manslaughter. Prosecutors Carrie Morrissey and Jason Lewis argued her negligence allowed live ammunition to be loaded into the gun used on set. Her defense team, however, pointed to Baldwin and the film's production crew, blaming them for creating a chaotic and unsafe environment. After deliberating for nearly 3 hours, the jury found Gutierrez-Reed guilty of involuntary manslaughter. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with the judge stating that she alone had turned a safe weapon into a lethal one. In July, Baldwin faced his own trial, also charged with involuntary manslaughter. Prosecutors argued Baldwin was reckless with firearms, pointed a loaded gun at Hutchins, and pulled the trigger, disregarding basic firearm safety protocols. Baldwin's defense, represented by attorney Alec contended that as an actor, Baldwin followed the directions given to him by the crew and that safety was the responsibility of the armorer and assistant director. After 2 days of testimony, the case was dismissed when Judge Mary Marlowe Sommer ruled the prosecutors had failed to properly turn over evidence to the defense, leading to the charges being dropped with prejudice. While under normal circumstances, this dramatic dismissal would have effectively ended Baldwin's criminal case, prosecutor Carrie Morrissey soon filed an appeal seeking to reinstate the charges. Yet by December, the prosecution withdrew the appeal, finally bringing an end to the saga. If you're interested in hearing more about this case, please check out our special coverage on the Baldwin case in the description below. What happened here? This case was probably the greatest demonstration of prosecutorial overreach that we have seen all year, certainly for a very long while. First off, the prosecution of Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, in my view, was justified. We can leave that there. She was responsible for the weapons, the ammo on the set. It was her job. She was the one to make sure that some tragedy like this did not occur. And her failure to properly check and render a gun safe begins and ends with her. And I think that criminal prosecution was justified. But Baldwin is an actor. When we say things like you should never point a weapon at anything that you are not willing to destroy, that's true for gun safety. Absolutely. But I would say that applies to anywhere except on a movie set. On a movie set, part of using weapons is pointing them at other people and is pulling the trigger while they're pointed at other people. Movie sets are different. It's play acting. It's supposed to be an environment where something like this has zero chance of ever taking place. Now, Baldwin, and this should be acknowledged, got into some hot water because he said many times publicly beforehand, could not keep his mouth shut, that he never pulled the trigger. And I know that testing was done of that gun and it was determined, and I think it probably would have been proven that he had in fact pulled the trigger on that gun. But I don't know if that is even the most important fact. How many hundreds, if not thousands of times has Alec Baldwin been handed a gun on a set and it never been a problem? As far as he's concerned, when he's being handed that gun, it's not a gun, it's a prop. And I know people are going to say, well, he still should have checked, and maybe he should have. But we're not talking about civil liability here. We're talking about criminal liability. When he got handed that gun, as far as he was concerned, that was a gun that he could use in a way very different than any other place on earth. He could use that gun to point it at other people. And in fact, part of his direction was to point it at people, which in this case meant pointing it at the camera where Helena Hutchins happened to be sitting. The other issue I take with this is that the prosecution of this case was problematic from the onset. If you remember, before bringing the charges, they announced they were going to bring charges. Then they brought the charges. Then they went on a press tour. Then we found out that one of the charges was mischarged and they had to dismiss it. And then they dismissed the charges altogether and had to refile them. And then prosecutors were recused and others were assigned. And to top it all off, we have this discovery violation. This is something I think it's important to appreciate and understand. Judges don't usually do this in these types of situations. I think this judge saw this discovery violation as an opportunity to end this entire mess, and she took it. A prosecutor's job is not to decide what evidence should be turned over and what should not. They are the stewards of the evidence, and they should turn it over and allow a judge what evidence can be used at trial and what cannot. Here, the prosecutor made that decision, and that was inappropriate. But many, many judges would see this and find it as some sort of discovery violation and some sort of way where a remedy could be found that wouldn't end the case entirely. This judge said, no, I'm taking this opportunity to say I'm going to dismiss this case with prejudice. I think that was because she saw the writing on the wall that this was a bad prosecution to begin with. But what do you guys think? Do you think that Baldwin found some lucky loophole, or do you think that this was a ill-fated prosecution to begin with? Let us know in the comments. Number 3, in April, a jury found Minnesota man NICOLAE Mew guilty of multiple criminal charges, including homicide, in the 2022 Apple River stabbings in Wisconsin. Mew, who took the stand in his own defense, was involved in a confrontation with several teens who had been drinking and tubing on the river when things took a shockingly violent turn. In July, Mew was sentenced to 20 years for first-degree reckless homicide. For more coverage on Mew's testimony, please see our video included in the description on this video. Number 4. Also in April, the Karen Reed murder trial became one of the most talked about cases of 2024, captivating public attention as it unfolded in Norfolk Superior Court, Massachusetts. Reed stood accused of killing her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe, in January of 2022. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Adam Lally, argued that Reed hit O'Keefe with her SUV, leading to blunt force trauma and hypothermia. In contrast, the defense, represented by attorneys Alan Jackson and David Yannetti, claimed Reed was the victim of an elaborate cover-up by law enforcement and others involved in the murder, presenting theories of a possible attack inside the home of O'Keefe's friend, Boston police officer Brian Albert, before his body was found outside. On July 1st, 2024, Judge Beverly Cannoni declared a mistrial after the jury sent a note declaring in no uncertain terms that they were unable to reach a unanimous verdict, having deliberated for 27 hours. A retrial on all charges is set for April 2025. We also have special coverage of this case. Please check out our playlist in the description. What happened here? This case was truly fascinating. We had allegations of a massive police cover-up. We had salacious text messages. We had dog bite experts. You name it, this case had it. But I think the most surprising turn came when the trial actually ended. If you remember, several jurors allegedly came forward after the case was dismissed, declaring a mistrial, and said that they had actually acquitted Karen Reed of the more serious charge in this case, and they were only deadlocked on the lesser included charge. And a lot of that, I think, went toward blame about the verdict slip in this case being a little confusing. You do not see that type of situation very often. Essentially, the jurors acted as a kind of mock jury trial for everybody involved. They let us know everything they were thinking without a verdict actually being rendered. And if this is true, what we're hearing from these jurors, there are lessons that can certainly be learned here. First, for the prosecution, this case is overcharged. I think that is absolutely true. There was little to no evidence that this was an intentional act on Karen Reed's part, that she meant to hit him with her car and that she meant to cause his death. I think that they were overextending their credibility with the jury by trying to make an argument like this. Why do that? Call it a horrible accident. Blame it on alcohol or negligence. if you want to pursue a case like this. But to say that there was some sort of intent involved all of this when you have very little, thin evidence to support that, learn the lesson that the jurors gave you the first time around. They were willing to acquit on that more serious charge. Learn that lesson and move forward. But the defense can also learn from this. Some of the jurors did believe that Karen Reed caused John O'Keefe's death. Some of the jurors do believe that her vehicle hit him. Some of the jurors did reject the defense theory of a cover-up completely. Now, the question that the defense has to consider moving forward is, would it be wise for them to pivot? Focus on intent and knowledge rather than this elaborate conspiracy theory and cover-up. End of the day, to me, this case comes down to one piece of evidence. That is the taillight fragments. Because either they got there because she hit him with her vehicle, and you can call it an accident or call it intentional, or they got there because of a massive police cover-up and frame job that involved several different people. People with varying degrees of experience, people with varying degrees of intelligence, to get all of these people to cooperate in planting evidence and lying about a murder and everything else, this entire cover-up. The question that really needs to be asked by all of the attorneys in this case is, which will the jury believe more? What do you guys think? Do you think it's time for the defense to pivot or to stick to the game plan from the first trial? It nearly worked. Maybe this time it will. Please let us know in the comments. Number 5, a former ballerina charged in the fatal shooting of her husband was convicted of manslaughter in late July. Ashley Benefield, dubbed the Black Swan, had been charged with second-degree murder when she took the stand to argue that she had shot her husband, Doug Benefield, in self-defense. A jury ultimately convicted her of the lesser crime of manslaughter on September 27, 2024. In December, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation. Number 6. In August, a former Las Vegas area elected official was convicted of killing an investigative journalist who wrote articles critical of his conduct in office. Robert Tejas was found guilty of first-degree murder in the stabbing death of Jeff Gehrman after a 2-week trial where Tejas testified in a rare and bizarre narrative style, meaning he spoke at length without being questioned by his attorney. Clark County District Court Judge Michelle Levitt sentenced Tejas in October to an additional 8 to 20 years on top of the 20 years to life for the murder. If you're interested in seeing a breakdown of Tejas' narrative style testimony, please see the video in the description below. Number 7. This brings us to October, when Sarah Boone was convicted of second-degree murder for the death of her boyfriend, George Torres Jr., who suffocated after being zipped inside a suitcase in their Winter Park, Florida home. While Boone initially claimed that the 2020 incident occurred during a drunken game of hide-and-seek, evidence revealed she recorded videos mocking Torres as he pleaded for help from inside the suitcase. An autopsy confirmed that Torres died from positional asphyxia. During the trial, Boone's defense argued that she suffered from battered spouse syndrome, suggesting her actions were influenced by past abuse. Boone also testified in her own defense. However, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict. On December 2, 2024, Judge Michael Kranick sentenced Boone to life in prison without the possibility of parole. If you're interested in seeing more of our coverage on this case, including her testimony, see the link in the description below. What happened here? This is one of the most strange and horrific cases that we have seen in a while. And at the center of it all is this bizarre character in the form of Sarah Boone. This was a woman who, beyond the idea that she had zipped someone up in a suitcase, made a lot of news basically for her conduct in court before her trial even began. She went through 8 attorneys before arriving at the unlucky gentleman who represented her at trial. And it showed in that trial. This case was set up for a defense of accident, if you want to call it that. It was drunken fun that turned horribly wrong. 2 people who were involved in a relationship drank too much, played this game. She went to sleep. Maybe a jury would have sympathized with her, but instead, likely motivated by Boone's own ego, she tried to turn Torres into the bad guy. She tried to make this about self-defense and battered spouse syndrome. Not only was the jury unpersuaded by all of this, they were likely offended by it. George Torres suffocated to death in one of the most horrific and nightmarish ways that I could imagine. Every breath that George Torres took was a little less than the last breath that he took. And as he was trapped inside a very dark and confined place and begged for his life, she laughed and mocked him. And then it comes to trial and she blames him. You can see why jurors did not respond to those arguments. But what do you guys think? Do you think had she had blamed it on an accident, she would have been more convincing to a jury? Please let us know in the comments. Number 8. The highly anticipated trial of Richard Allen began in October, 2 years after his arrest for the 2017 murders of 2 teen girls. Prosecutors said Allen killed 13-year-old Abigail Abby Williams and 14-year-old Liberty Libby German while luring them to their deaths while they were on a hike not far from their home in Delphi, Indiana. The case went cold for more than 5 years until Allen was arrested in 2022. The trial garnered widespread media attention despite Judge Fran Gull's ban on cameras and all electronic devices from the courtroom. The state's case included a crime lab technician's match of a bullet found at the scene to Allen's gun and his own admission of being on the bridge the day of the murders. Additionally, Allen confessed to the crime multiple times, including in jail phone calls to his wife and mother. The defense countered that the state had no DNA or digital evidence linking Allen to the crime. The bullet evidence was inconclusive at best, but most crucially, that his time in solitary confinement warped his mind and led to false confessions. After 17 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for nearly 19 hours before convicting Allen on 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of murder while committing or attempting to commit kidnapping. On December 20th, Judge Gull sentenced him to 130 years in prison. What happened here? Probably no other case that took place this year of 2024 divided the true crime community more than the trial of Richard Allen. Some felt that justice was finally served after several years for these 2 young, innocent girls. Others felt very strongly that this was a gross miscarriage of justice. I blame much of that on how this case was handled. You remember, first, Allen's attorneys were removed by the judge in this case, and then only reassigned after the appellate courts got involved. Then he was housed in solitary confinement for reasons that are still not quite clear, despite the obvious impact that this had on his psyche. But at the end of the day, it was the extreme lack of transparency in this case that did the most damage, I feel, to the public trust in the outcome more than anything else. And why? First, you had jurors coming from an outside location, nearly an hour away. Okay, fine. But then they were sequestered. Extremely. No contact with the outside world. No electronics, no television, no media of any source. Then there was a gag order put in place. Then there were no cameras allowed in courtroom, no electronics allowed in courtroom, and no guaranteed seats for the media. It was as if it wasn't just about protecting the integrity of the trial. It was about keeping all eyes from the outside looking as to how this trial was conducted. I'm all for protecting the integrity of a trial, but when you do this, when you go this far to these lengths, you breed mistrust. You raise questions in the minds of people. And no wonder people are so divided about this. No wonder there is a large group of people who do not have any faith that justice was served in this case. And to me, that is a tragedy. But what do you guys think? Do you think the handling of this case did damage to the integrity of the judicial system? Please let us know in the comments. Number 9, after languishing in court for months and ultimately becoming Georgia's longest-running criminal trial, the YSL RICO prosecution, which began with testimony in November of 2023, finally ended late in 2024. The original case alleged a wide-ranging conspiracy among 28 co-defendants, including rapper Young Thug, charged as being members of the criminal enterprise YSL, or Young Slime Life. Late this year, several defendants, including Young Thug, whose real name is Jeffrey Lamar Williams, took plea deals. Weeks later, the final 2 defendants received their verdicts. Diamante Kendrick, who raps as Yak Gotti, and Shannon Stillwell were found not guilty on a bevy of charges ranging from murder to gun possession. Stillwell was the only defendant actually convicted by a jury, found guilty on only 1 count of felony gun possession, and sentenced by Judge Paige Whitaker to 10 years on probation with credit for time already served. Number 10, closing out the year in the jam-packed month of October, Daniel Penny, a former U.S. Marine, faced trial for second-degree manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide for the May 2023 death of Jordan Neely, a 30-year-old homeless man whom Penny restrained in a chokehold on a New York City subway. After over 20 hours of deliberations, a jury found Penny not guilty of criminally negligent homicide. The decision came after the jury deadlocked on the more serious charge of manslaughter, leading the judge to dismiss the count on the prosecution's request. Penny had faced up to 14 years for the manslaughter charge and 4 years in prison for the lesser charge of negligent homicide. Wow. And that was 2024. We did our best to cover the most consequential cases, but I am sure that we missed a few. Let us know in the comments, what was the case that you feel defined 2024? Be sure to tune in next week as we look ahead at the cases we will be following closely in 2025. But in the meantime, I am your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on all social media at Joshua Ritter ESQ or at joshuaritter.com. Thank you again for joining me. Have a great week, and I will see you again next time on Courtroom Confidential.